Crisis Conference. So thrilled that you're all here. I've just been sitting behind the scenes while Jeff and Dr. Hardy were chatting, and so thrilled to see so many people here from Rome and Australia and the UK, etc. So it's just wonderful, wonderful to see everybody here. Thank you so much for joining us at the Center for Crisis and Risk Communications. We are based in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and we follow the teachings and brain science research of Dr. Vincent Cavello, and we are thrilled to now be toting and learning from and gleaming the knowledge of my now man crush, Dr. Timothy Coombs, who is arguably, I'm going to go off script here, Tim. But I'll read the script and then I'll do my thing. So I'm so pleased to introduce you to Dr. Timothy Coombs. He is a professor in the Department of Communication at Texas A&M University. He researches in the area of crisis communication. He's authored books in crisis communication. You might look for Ongoing Crisis Communication and Code Red in the Boardroom. The forthcoming Reputation Challenges in Sport, Theory and Practice, and numerous other book chapters on the topic of crisis and risk communications. And if I'm still playing my cards right, I might be a contributing author to his next book. And if I continue to play my cards right, we will maybe have Dr. Coombs on the Center for Crisis and Risk Communications Advisory Board as we move forward and continue to do great things here and support organizations in their preparedness for crisis and high risk, high concern situations. Dr. Coombs, again, I'm off script here, is in my mind and in my world, one of the leaders, most relevant, current, amazing experts in research. What comes out of this man's mind is so incredible. And Tim, we're so glad to have you here. And I don't know, can I say anything else or should I just turn it over to you? Because I just want to soak you up for a little bit.
I appreciate the very nice introduction and the kind words. Let me share the screen here so we can make sure you have it. I was teaching the other day and realized I had forgotten to share the screen on one class period. So I want to make sure it's here. And I'm really happy to be talking here because this is one of those events where as an academic, we get to connect up with practitioners. And when you're doing research in crisis communication, that's huge because the whole idea is to try and see, well, what do we have in research that might be useful to all you out there who are practitioners? And that really is going to be sort of my focus today. Is I want to talk about what academics might have to offer to you. I'm going to use the term might because I want to talk about the lenses through which we see all of this. And towards that end, there are 3 points I want to focus on. And the first is kind of talk about this evidence-based approach, kind of what that means. I know sometimes it gets a little bit jargony. That's what separates academics from the rest of the world is that we create our own little jargon. And then we need to kind of break that down when we talk to other people who aren't academics. And some fields are better at that than others. And I'd like to think crisis communication, we're pretty good at that. And then I'm going to talk about the ideas from crisis communication research, particularly the ordinary. And I want to talk about also some of the extraordinary things that people face and where research might help there. And then just some complications that occur along the way with crisis communication across a wide range of situations that you might be using for crisis communication. And I'm going to start with this idea of evidence-based. And evidence-based is a way of thinking about how you bring research together with experience. If we want to use an older term, we can think about synergy. And synergy was this idea that you have these two different things. And when you bring them together, it creates something unique. It's greater than the sum of the parts. So it's not 2 + 2 = 4, but 2 + 2 = 6 or 7. So there's something better going on there. And that's really the idea behind the evidence-based approach, to try and kind of capture that uniqueness when you bring two things together. And in this case, the things are research results and professional experience. And coming out of the research side, that's what I want to bring, some results. But that has to be filtered through your professional experience for this to really work. And here's kind of the steps in the process. The idea is that in research, we're trying to figure out what works. So we're looking at crisis response strategies, which ones are optimal. And by optimal, we mean ones that serve best to benefit the stakeholders, potential victims, and the organization in crisis. And we also want to figure out which ones are suboptimal. What's the bad stuff? What do you just stay away from and why? And then when are these various strategies optimal or suboptimal? We kind of spend our time doing this and running various types of studies and experiments. But on the professional side, you all need to interpret that through your own experiences. You've worked in crisis, you know some things that work and don't work. And particularly, if you go down to the next point there, you know what work well for your organization or not. And also in your industry. We just heard some fascinating information about the travel industry. Each industry kind of has some unique features. And I've been doing a lot of work lately within the sports industry. And they have some unique characteristics when it comes to crisis. So you got to then take it and filter it through that and decide, all right, for me, does this research make sense? And how might I apply it to my own world? And it also then falls to us on the academic side to be in venues like this where we can say, hey, here's some research ideas we think might help you. Because it's crazy for us to think, oh, well, I'm a working professional. I'm going to try and find some academic journals to read. You have better things to do with your time. And I don't like reading a lot of those articles. They're rather dull and boring. But we can kind of talk about what are the key ideas, because in research articles, there's a lot of stuff that you have to do to get published that if you just kind of break it away, what are we really talking about? And I think that's one of the real problems we have in academics, is breaking away from that and talking about what really is there. So I want to transition into the next part and kind of talk about the best academic evidence. And best is an evaluative term that we're talking about here, and I'm going to talk about that. And what I mean by best is really the evidence that you can trust. All right, can we really rely upon this? Because there's a lot of academic research that's good and it's interesting, but I wouldn't trust it a lot if I was looking for advice on how to handle a crisis, because it's real interpretive in nature and very subjective, and I'm not really sure would it work in other areas or not. And that's why I talk about studies that can establish cause and effect relationships, so that we know when we do an intervention, this is the typical result we get. Because you want to avoid these really speculative studies. Again, they're interesting and they might have some insights that overall maybe someone could use, but I'd be a little bit hesitant if I had lives or money at stake on some of the results from the research. I want something that I feel more comfortable with, that I can really trust. And so what I've tried to do here is to kind of distill down and look at those ideas. And behind this is social science. And it's about playing the odds. It's not about making guarantees. I always tell my students, this should work. That doesn't mean it will work. This is not the hard sciences. This is not like, oh, we have certain laws of physics and they typically aren't broken. Well, in social science, we don't have laws. We have odds are good on this one. And when you're talking with managers about what they should do or not do in a crisis, the smart managers ask you why, and research helps to explain why. This is why. This is what usually works. Now again, it's not 100%. So what I've done is I've identified what I think are two really good bets. So if I were in the Las Vegas of the crisis world and I had to place my bets, I would bet on these two theories. And I'm going to take you through these theories and tell you, well, here's some ideas from them that might benefit you. And then when we come back with the complications, we'll talk about some of the limits to that. Why sometimes you shy away from this advice. Sometimes it's experience, but sometimes there's some other biases we might have when we're making these types of decisions. Stealing thunder. Stealing thunder it's a great name for a theory, and it's like they took it out of the legal system, and the legal system says if I'm a lawyer and I know there's a flaw in my case, I bring that flaw up before my opponent does, and that way that flaw does less damage to me. And that's the whole idea behind stealing thunder when we start talking about it in the crisis context. Keeping in mind, you can't always steal thunder. If there's an event that is very fast moving, very high profile, some sort of accident or explosion, you can't steal thunder, because stealing thunder says you are the first to disclose the crisis exists. What that means is you're looking at crises that, for the most part, were internal problems that have arisen and created trouble for the organization. And when you look at the data from a lot of the professional organizations tracking crises, that's a big chunk of what's out there. Each year, those are the types of crises when it's being tracked are the ones that garner the most media attention and create the most problems for organizations. This is when you've done something wrong within the organization. This could be management misconduct. It could be financial. It could be moral in nature. It could involve discrimination. It could involve putting your stakeholders at risk with a dangerous product in some ways. The idea is you know the problem exists and you have the chance to be the first to report it out. In those cases, it reduces the damage that crisis is going to do to your organization. The best evidence of that is you will take less reputational damage. Another advantage of it is it alerts stakeholders sooner to a risk. So if this is something you've done that places them at risk, all right, well, the stakeholders benefit too, because now they know, oh, stay away from that product. But for the most part, you're really looking more at the damage to the organization, because just by the nature of the crisis, they're more likely to be damaging internally. But if you think about sort of also employees as victims, there can be some ways to where you're helping your stakeholders as well, the potential victims. And that's a point we're going to return to in just a minute, the ideas of the victims. And this is the basic elements of stealing thunder. Stealing thunder has this beauty to it because it's simple yet highly effective. This has been tested multiple countries around the world, good companies, bad companies, and it always seems to work. It always seems to benefit. So that's why I say, if you want a good bet, this is one of them. However, something we're going to talk about in just a little bit, managers are oftentimes hesitant on this one, though, and we'll talk about why. And I think you can probably guess why managers are hesitant. The second one is situational crisis communication theory, and it's about accountability. And it's abbreviated SCCT. Name's not nearly as great as stealing thunder. I wish I'd come up with a better name. This is my theory, and I've always been disappointed in the name, but that's what it became, and haven't thought of a better one. And why change now? Like changing your name for some reason. The basics are that your crisis response has to match the perceived crisis responsibility, and it talks about optimal versus suboptimal responses. And the idea is that different crises produce predictable perceptions of crisis responsibility. That if you know you're in a particular type of crisis, I'm in a product harm situation here, created because I had a mechanical malfunction, or I'm in a management misconduct. We've just found out that there's been some systematic sexual harassment that's been going on in the organization for multiple years. These different crises have predictable levels of crisis responsibility they're going to generate. Now, that doesn't mean every one of your stakeholders are going to see it the same, but we know generally this is how people are going to see it. Some they see rather low on the end. Incidents such as when a disaster strikes and it affects your organization, the responsibility is low. Same thing is if you're talking about a case of workplace violence, employees creating violence against other employees. on the lower end. But when you start getting into ideas such as sexual harassment, discrimination, knowingly putting out faulty products, there's a lot of responsibility on that end. And we've also found out recently that moral outrage can make a crisis extreme and a lot more challenging for you to manage. And I'm going to get more to that notion of moral outrage and what that means and implications for crises here in just a minute. But the focal point really in SCCT has always been on the victims and the potential victims. That's what crisis communication is really about. Too often, I hear critics of crisis communication saying, oh, they're just in it to protect the organization. This is just to cover the organization's backside. That's bad crisis communication. Good crisis communication puts the victims and potential victims front and center and addresses their concerns, knowing that by addressing those concerns, that's also in the best interest of the organization. Organizations, the bottom line is they're composed of people. And usually they're composed of good people who want to do the right thing. And I think academics are often overly critical of corporations, thinking they're all evil and out for no good, and even some government agencies, but that's not the case. It really needs the focal point of it. And in SCCT, the communication advice is that you begin with what we call the ethical-based response. An ethical-based response is, if you're familiar with the concept of psychological first aid, I think there's a lot of similarities between those two concepts. I've been trying to integrate psychological first aid more into what we're doing with SCCT. The two things you need to do is you need to tell people how to protect themselves physically. Do I need to shelter in place? Do I need to evacuate the area? Two different actions, and if I do the wrong one, there could be serious consequences for me or my family if I'm trying to evacuate or keep safe in some way. The product is bad. Can I still use it? Should I still eat it? Should I throw it out? Should I take it back? Should I get it repaired? Or should I just never ever use it again? We have those types of concerns. If you were part of the airbag recall that's been going on for 6-7 years now among cars, it's nice to know when they tell you, like, hey, you need to replace your airbag. It could injure you, or just a case recently, it could kill you if it goes off. It's like, okay, yeah, that's how I protect myself physically. I guess I won't really drive that car until I can get my airbag replaced. My favorite was they called me up and said, oh yeah, we need to replace that airbag. It's going to be 3 months before we can get you one, but okay, I guess I'll just be extra careful when I'm driving around. But you also help them to cope psychologically. And that's an important function within communication that we can overlook. Expressions of concern are about that. And what I call curative actions, some people refer to them as countermeasures. These are what you're doing to try and prevent a repeat of that crisis in the future. So what steps are you taking so that doesn't happen again? And that's on the psychological side, because when there has been a crisis, let's say, for instance, you have had some food and it was contaminated, and you were a group of the unfortunate people who were food poisoned by it. Well, you want to know that's not going to happen again before you decide you want to buy that product. The same thing, when there's been an airline accident, you want to know, why did the plane crash, and what are you doing to make sure that plane doesn't crash again? And Sally Ray wrote an interesting book a number of years ago about the airline industry and how they're very good at that. They figure out, oh, that's the problem. Now let's mitigate that problem the best we can. A good example of that is wind shears. Doppler radar helps them to eliminate wind shear problems, and that takes one of the risks away for flights taking off and landing and crashing because of wind shears. So they tend to be very, very good at that. And that really needs to be the center point of your crisis communication. And we talk a lot in the crisis communication research, if you read it, about reputation management. But for me, this is what you do beforehand. This is the key. If you don't do this, all your reputation management strategies are rather meaningless, because you have failed in your first responsibility to be accountable to those people who have been injured or might be injured by your crisis. So you need to be accountable to them. The theory talks a lot about responsibility, and accountability gets layered on top of that. Because many times in a crisis, while you may not be responsible for the crisis, you're still accountable for it. It's your organization, it's your actions. You need to be able to address them in some way. So I think it's better to take about accountability, because then we get into these weird academic debates about like, oh, well, you spend all your time debating responsibility. It's like, no, you just really need to be accountable for that. Now, when your crisis responsibility is really high, and these are situations like management misconduct, you need that. And even when you have human error types of accidents, an employee is unloading hazardous chemical, they make a mistake, there's a chemical release, it's a human error. We know that happens, but it really upsets stakeholders and they hold you highly responsible for that. Well, what you do is then you're going to need to add in some combination of an apology. And apology, you're just accepting responsibility for the crisis. You know, this is our mistake. We did something bad. And then compensation, and that's some for payment for the disruption. You know, it might be cash, it might be discount coupons, it might be some sort, you know, paying for expenses when people have mad. My favorite case of compensation, just because when you hear about it, you realize how crazy it was. This neighborhood, you know, we're not talking about 20 families or so, had to move out of the neighborhood for 2 days because there was a petrochemical pipeline that leaked. And when they came back in, they found coupons for 1 free pizza. And people were going like, that's it? I'm displaced for a couple days and you give me a free pizza? And the funniest comments were like, and that didn't even include a drink. It's like, you at least could have thrown in a drink with that. So make sure that the compensation is equivalent. I'm sure they thought they were being nice with the pizza, but you know, next time give them the drink too, and maybe some breadsticks, and people will be much happier about it. And so these are some of the basic ideas from SCCT. The ethical-based response, crisis that's not too extreme, it's going to work. When there's high responsibility, all right, we're going to need to add in some kind of apology. I need to talk about what I did wrong, and some compensation. And you can use it in combination or separately, because when you offer compensation, people will interpret that as an apology. And oftentimes they want that more than, oh, you said some nice things, versus, oh, you covered my costs. I need to get my car detailed because your chemical release, while it was not hazardous, dirtied my car. And that's what one organization did when they kind of covered this neighborhood with this white powder that was not dangerous, is that they offered everyone free car detailing, and people really liked that because they cleaned their cars. And if they're like me, my car probably needed it anyway. So it's come out that way. In terms of the crisis outcomes we find with SCCT, when you follow this advice, there's less reputational damage to your organization. You're going to have, you're less likely to engage in negative word of mouth about the organization. And there's less of a drop in purchase intention, and you get a quicker return to stock valuation, which these are more from the corporate side. But even if you're an agency doing this type of work, even though responsibility isn't, you're not responsible for the crisis, and COVID-19 is a good example of that, you're still accountable for the performance of your crisis communication. And this again goes back to the notion, if your performance and your communication is focused on the victims, that's when you're going to be effective. When you're focused on yourself, and in the case of the United States, your desire to be reelected, that's when it goes bad. And you have problems with your responses in those situations. There can be complications to this. And we've been doing some interesting research here and some also going on in Europe, trying to kind of sort through some of these complications. What makes it even more difficult? Because I think from the research side, I think we have a pretty good handle on what works in your, if you want to call it, if you have an easy crisis versus what are the ones that are the more complicated ones that you can wind up with. And one of those is this idea of moral outrage. And moral outrage is a distinct form of emotion that is evoked by your crisis situation. And it's this combination of responsibility. People say, yeah, that the organization, they're responsible for this. Injustice, this really is not how you treat people. And greed, you're doing this to make money. That's why you're in this. And those come together to create moral outrage. This is a very negative emotion. And one of the things we do know about negative emotions, and this, you see this in the marketing literature as well, it motivates people to take actions against an organization. Whether that's, I'm not gonna buy from you anymore, I'm not gonna use your services, to going out and actively online trying to strike back against that organization. It's the technical term for that is organizational vengeance. They want to get you. And now with social media, it's easier to get at you because you're out there and they can communicate to you more directly. So instead of just a nasty mail they sent you, now they can do nasty posts and even go on your own social media site and go after you with this. Because what we found with this, what triggers this moral outrage tends to be management misconduct is one. And that's when managers knew better and they did it anyway. They engaged in illegal behavior, immoral behavior, some combination of the two that they might have. And that also relates to scansis. And that's when a crisis is also a scandal. A scandal denotes that there is a moral dimension to it that has really upset people. So you can have management misconduct that doesn't necessarily have that strong moral component to it that upsets people. And what I want to do is, here are just some pictures of 3 companies that evoked a lot of moral outrage. The Sears one is from a number of years ago, but when you ask people about it and you show them what happened, yeah, the moral outrage, you can assess it, it goes up really high. And what Sears did, back when Sears used to be something, they had a lot of automotive centers and people would take their cars in and be told, oh, you need such and such repairs. Well, it turns out you didn't need those repairs. So it's like, oh, we think you need new brakes. They put new brakes on the car. You didn't need new brakes. And they actually did an undercover investigation led by an attorney general's office of one of our Western states that exposed this and exposed what Sears was doing. And the reason it was occurring was that employees would get bonuses if they could hit the sales quota. And so they were encouraged to do this because also then the center could get more money, the whole location. It was just a bad system, and it was based on greed. The employees and the specific locations wanted more money. Wells Fargo and the fake accounts. Wells Fargo decided they were going to increase their cash. And they did something that you see as a plot line in a lot of movies and television shows. We take a little bit of money from a lot of people and it adds up. Wells Fargo started creating accounts for existing customers, not telling customers about those accounts, charging them, 50 cents, $1, something. And people weren't paying close attention. It was a small amount of money, but with millions of people, it did add up for Wells Fargo. And this was a case where you have, yes, they were responsible. They knowingly did this. It was an injustice. You shouldn't do that. And it was motivated by greed. They wanted to make more money. EpiPen, if you have allergies or know people with allergies, you're familiar with EpiPens. These are life-saving devices. When people are exposed to an allergen, the EpiPen can save their lives. EpiPen, a few years back, decided to suddenly increase the price of an EpiPen 400%. That's a lot of money. And people were wondering, well, what happened? Why did have your production costs gone up? No. Well, then why are you raising the price? Well, it was profit. They wanted to make more money, and they eventually they had to scale it back. But people were very concerned because they were talking about saying, well, I don't think I can afford them. So now, instead of when it reaches their expiration date, I'm not going to get a new one because I can't afford it. I'm just going to hope the old one works. Well, hoping the old one works when you're potentially going into shock is not something you want to risk. So again, that's one that triggers a lot of moral outrage because people see that the company's just trying to make money. They did this on purpose, and this just isn't fair to people, because especially lower income people raising the price, it could mean they no longer had access to this, and that's was quite disturbing as a part of it. So it does occur. You do have these crises that generate this moral outrage and can create bigger problems for an organization. And when it comes to crisis communication, the advice is you have to talk now about moral acknowledgement instead of an apology. Because moral acknowledgement says, I know what I did wrong. This is what it was. And then moral reform. What are you doing to not do that again? Because again, this is you're promising you're going to do better in the future, and it reflects that sort of curative nature or countermeasures that are being taken. This has an effect upon people. Your traditional apologies and compensation don't. People don't like that, because when we talk about crisis outcomes, think about reputation, negative word of mouth. Your traditional responses and apologies don't impact that. And even these have a different type of effect when you're looking about your outcomes for your crisis communication. Because what you see, instead of impacting your reputation and negative word of mouth, these common outcomes, what you see is that it creates a perception of empathy, and empathy is a path towards forgiveness. And with these moral violations, really talking forgiveness is kind of your end goal with all of this. And it helps to reduce value incongruence. And this is really important. And think about it this way, that before your crisis created moral outrage, you and your stakeholders had this overlap. That stakeholders looked at your organization and said, I see some of myself in you. And that's identification, and that's very powerful. And identification helps to explain why people stay with organizations, customers, employees, and so forth. But when you have your crisis and they see you engaging in this morally questionable behavior that creates outrage on their part, now you're starting to go apart. Right? You're starting to see a lack of congruence in your values. So they're moving apart. And when you engage in that idea of a moral acknowledgement and moral reform, that helps to start bringing it back together. So it's not going to be your pre-crisis stage, but it's better. So we're going from it's not good to better. And your big risk is if this keeps going in this direction, there's going to be a strong disidentification with your organization, and you become what some people in management refer to as infamous organizations. It's not that you have a bad reputation, it's that you're viewed as infamous, that it's a very negative situation for you. When they hear your name, they just think bad things. So it's not a bad reputation. It's like you're evil. You're a bad organization. My dog once out. Just stay put. Come on. He's at the door. All right. So again, just kind of summarizing up from some of this, that research can offer some insights and can help the practice. And I know myself and a lot of people, we research in this area for that goal, to try and contribute to the practice in some way. And there's greater confidence for how this stuff works for less extreme crises. Although for stealing thunder, that's going to work really kind of across the board for you. And then again, crisis managers interpret those insights through their own experiences. So you kind of take it and interpret and see what's going on for all of that. But even with all this advice that's going on out there, we can still see a few other ways that things get complicated. And one of those is decision making. And I want to talk a little bit about this here at the end, because you make a lot of choices along the way, and crisis communication is one of them. But that's what you do as a crisis team. You all know you make decisions. And you do that under stress. And what we know from research coming out of Europe, and this should be with your own personal experiences, is that when decision making is done under stress and crises, they tend to be intuitive rather than analytic. And intuitive just means you're going on experience. And that's not inherently a bad thing. There's nothing necessarily wrong with an intuitive decision versus an analytic decision. The only danger is when there are heuristic biases that we're not really aware of, they're unconscious, that are influencing our decisions and taking us in a bad direction. So because intuition is based on experience, that's a valuable thing, because you all know what's one of the key characteristics you want in a crisis manager. You want experience. Well, that's because it's part of the intuitive part. But when you do these intuitive decisions, you can have these biases creep in. And an example of that is called myopic loss aversion. Big name, but it essentially means when people make decisions, and this is across context. This was actually done out of economics. These are ideas that come out of what's called behavioral economics. And it says that people fear loss more than they value gain. And people are also, we notice, short-sighted. They're looking at what gets me somewhere fastest. So I want to take that course of action. So you might avoid a course of action that long-term might benefit you and your stakeholders, but in the short term, it doesn't look as beneficial. It looks like a little bit more kind of on the loss situation. And that's what we have with stealing thunder. And I've talked to managers and even CEOs about this. I remember, it's been about 8 years ago, I was actually talking to a group of CEOs up in Vancouver, and I'm kind of walking them through stealing thunder, and they're like, oh yeah, we get that, and the data is good, and this is good evidence. But I don't know that I could convince my managers to do this. I'm like, oh wow, if the CEO can't do that, it's like, what about on the manager side? And researchers in Europe studying the same process find the same thing, that people are going like, okay, if I steal thunder, that is loss. I am now taking my crisis public and I will have loss. And the thinking is, you might guess, if I don't say anything about my crisis, maybe nobody ever finds out about it and I never have any loss. That's a risky bet. I'm sure that most organizations have taken that gamble, and occasionally it does pay off. But if it doesn't pay off, it makes it a whole lot worse for you. And myopic loss aversion helps to explain a lot of what's going on. And that's just a bias that we all carry around with us in all types of decisions that we make, but one that could have a negative impact in a crisis, because what it does is it allows companies to settle for a suboptimal response, because suboptimal responses, in stealing thunder, these suboptimal responses, they don't steal thunder. That's not a good payoff for me long-term as an organization. Same way in SCCT, when I have a very accommodative response, I go out there and, I've done the ethical-based response, and now I'm engaging in, say, apology or some sort of moral acknowledgement. Immediately, I'm going to take a bigger hit because of that. But the data and the reputational data coming out from the professional side says, yes, you take a quick hit, but your reputation comes back faster and stronger when you use that response. That's long-term, but because we're short-term thinking, myopic loss aversion said I stay away from that. And we see a similar pattern when you use those really accommodative strategies from SCCT in stock markets. There is a very detailed study done looking at stocks and responses. And again, if you respond, yes, you take a quick hit, but you come back faster and stronger with your stock valuations. But that's a long-term approach, and people aren't always willing to commit to the long term, which again is unfortunate. But just to kind of keep in mind, there can be some biases, and just to think about whether or not these biases are creeping in and taking a little bit more time with the decision. And that doesn't mean deliberating something for hours or days. It can just be a matter of minutes. And even in high pressure teams such as SWAT teams, if one member of the team has a concern about an action they're about to take, such as breaching a hotel to go in to apprehend someone, they'll raise it and they'll discuss it quickly to decide whether they really should engage in that action or not. So I know we think sometimes, oh, decision making, it can take forever, but you can just sort of review and see whether there's something we might have missed along the way, or are we being a little too short-sighted in our approach. The last sort of danger and complication I want to mention is the double crisis. And the double crisis holds for corporations, but also this is very applicable if you are a government agency as well. And the double crisis says that your response was so bad, it in itself is another crisis. So you have taken the crisis and you have intensified it by making it worse. And I like to think about, in a crisis, you can think, but there's this crisis clock, that when a crisis hits, it's running. And when the crisis clock is running, people are at risk. The organization is at risk, their stakeholders are at risk. And when you stop that crisis clock, people are no longer at risk. What a double crisis does is, for the organization, it extends the time of that crisis, because now it's so bad, it makes it worse. It in itself, that's what then the media talks about, how bad the response was by the organization. Quick examples of that. We saw that with Volkswagen and Dieselgate. Their response was so bad, it kept media attention focused on Volkswagen. They took additional reputational damage. Here in the United States, whether it's the national level or in various states, one of which I happen to live in, the response for COVID-19 has been so bad. It's been the things we say in a crisis: you should be fast, you should be consistent. We're not getting either of those. It's slow and it's inconsistent. That's a double crisis, because what we're talking about is how badly our governments at multiple levels have handled that. And in fact, in the US, probably the best level it's been handled at has been at actually the local level, with cities and with mayors handling it better than anyone else. But that, again, you can be so bad in your response that it hurts. So it's not the notion that there are times people think, oh, crisis communication, it's so easy. All you have to just say anything and it's fine. No, saying anything is not fine. It can make the situation worse. Saying anything often is reactive. On some hand, it can just be sort of ad hoc, spur of the moment, and that's not what you want. What you want in a crisis response is to be strategic, because the strategy is there to make things better. Your strategy is people will be safer, the organization is going to recover. You know, see those two kind of working in concert with one another. And that's what you need to do. You're guided by strategy. And I think that's when you're developing strategies. I think the academic literature is one option to kind of looking at some ways to guide you for strategies you might use, and then taking what you read and you see in the literature, saying, okay, how does it work for me? How can I tweak that? Will that really work for me here? Will this work for my organization or my industry? So you kind of then adapt it to what you're doing. And hopefully that gave you a somewhat interesting look at some of what we're doing on the academic side and how it might apply out to what you all are doing in the profession. Because as I said, there are a number of us in the field, and that's why we do what we do, because we're hoping that this will translate over and be usable to those within the profession. With that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coombs. You know, this is still out on my desk, and this is, you know, we use this in every one of the courses that we teach, and I don't think SCCT or situational crisis communication theory is a bad name at all. It resonates for us, and so I know I do, and I know many of my colleagues. Dr. Ryan is on here. I know we appreciate the research and the theories that you brought forward, and that it's helped inform many of us who are on the performance side of, or the tactical side of crisis communication. So I appreciate that very much. You talked a little bit about intuitive decision making, which is a really great segue to our next presenter, Daryl Black. So I just appreciate that you did that for us, because Daryl has got some really great insights on crisis leadership and how to lead through crisis. So that was a great segue. I also wanted to acknowledge moral outrage. Several of our attendees today had some issues with the registration process. And so I just wanted to acknowledge and express our gratitude for their patience. We were, technology, this is all new, doing virtual conferences, and certainly a learning curve along the way. And so integrating multiple platforms, we've learned, but I'm glad everybody's here and that seems to settle. Tim, I could talk to you forever, but I do want to make sure I get the questions addressed from our folks who have attended. So one question is, when you conduct your research, like you talked about your case studies, do you meet with the organizations that were in the crisis? And if so, like how open are they typically to sharing their experiences and what they did right and where they made their mistakes? So is that, you get right in there and dig into those companies?
Unfortunately, that's rare where you get access to it. Most organizations, when they've had crises, are like, no, that's not really something we want to talk about. And I'll give you an example of that. I'm in Texas, and one of the biggest brands in Texas is Bluebell ice cream. And Bluebell has a strong connection to Texas A&M. The people who run it are graduates from there. They have their name on our baseball field. I've had graduate students try to do research with them and ask them about when they had their foodborne illness problem and had to shut down for a few months. They don't want to talk about that at all. Even with, when you're at A&M, you're known as an Aggie, and they didn't even want to talk to fellow Aggies, so they're not going to talk to anyone else. I think companies should be, it's nice when they are more open. I can understand why they don't want to talk about it. One that was very open was JetBlue. JetBlue, in part because the researcher had worked for them at one point in time in a consulting role, was able to go in and get really good. They were very open and willing to reflect upon it. Organizations have different reasons for being private. A lot of times they're afraid it might, in the US at least, they're afraid of lawsuits and they don't want more information to come out with that. So I wish that was more. I think that's one of the weakest areas of the crisis communication, is we get very little direct access to the decision makers and the people making choices in the crisis. That's why some of the research in Europe is much better. The European organizations tend to be much more open and allow people in to do research. So unfortunately, the answer is very rarely we get to do that.
And that, again, sir, is a really great segue to the European realm. So this question comes to you from UK. And Amanda's saying she'd be interested in research about how crisis decisions add to societal inequalities. Is there anything being considered in this area?
Yeah, that's one of sort of the complicating factors that we're trying to look at more now, is that in generally, and within the academic realms, there's a school of thought, critical theory. And the critical theorists, when they look at crisis communication, that's what they identify, that it does kind of support inequalities, because what you're having is you're still looking at decisions and choices being made that favor sort of the dominant, more important groups. And so you don't always make decisions with the less powerful groups in mind. We see that particularly in the disaster research, and that's something that we're trying to work to create, that there are some racial biases that need to be acknowledged, and why many people of color in the US are more at risk for disasters than others are. And we even saw that with COVID-19. And part of that is who is making decisions. If all the people making decisions are of a particular group, they don't necessarily represent the interests of those down below. And so that is a problem. And I would say probably more so on the government side than on the corporate side, because on the corporate side, you're probably looking more at their interests and a sensitivity to that, particularly among consumer-facing organizations, because they know, they see that as a problem and a concern that they need to address. But that is a problem that we do see among the decision-making, particularly on the governmental side.
Thank you. There's so many great questions here. I'd like to get to them all, but you know, this one I think is really relevant to everybody. And the question to you is, what is one thing that you'd recommend we all do on our first day back to our organization following this conference?
Yeah, after you use the hand sanitizer from the previous one. I think when you get back, reassess your risks. Yeah, I mean, this is, you don't want to have, this is just the risk of the month, but I think this allows other managers to see the importance of risk assessment and continual risk assessment. I'm a big advocate of organizations meeting regularly, whether it's monthly or biweekly, and having a risk committee and looking at and seeing what's going on out in the world and in getting a better consensus on your risks. Because if you don't manage your risks, that has direct implications on your ability to manage the crisis. So that would be my recommendation. Leverage that current focus on risk, because everyone in your organization is going to be worried about that. I've been following some of the stuff on the risk management side, and even if it's just how do we insure against this in the future, there's a lot of risk discussion. Use that to really sort of formalize and try and get continual risk evaluation onto the agenda at your organization.
Great. I'll get one more in here, but before I do, I just want to thank you again, Dr. Coombs, and just to note that you're also doing tomorrow a special session for our public relations class at Mount Royal University here in Calgary. You're dialing into them with Dr. Ryan, and that's such a very good gift. And I know Dr. Ryan and Dr. McNichol, I think she's on this call also, really appreciate your willingness to do that. And I'm hoping to step out and jump in on that too. So thank you very much for doing that as well.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Yeah, I think so. Dr. Ryan and I, we've used your books, and that's what we preach to these students. So it would be great to have you drop in there. Darren, I'd love to get to your question, but I just have to do this last one. And you're being asked, Dr. Coombs, and well, they're thanking you for sharing, and then asking, are there any case studies and or data that come to mind that prove effective when navigating the conversation with management regarding the value and importance of thunder stealing?
Not yet. There's some research being done in Europe that has some promise on that, but it's because of those biases you hit that people are like, but if we don't say anything, but the cases, you can show them cases where they didn't steal thunder and how badly it hurt the organization. And Wells Fargo is a great case. That Wells Fargo knew at least a few weeks, maybe a few months ahead of time that the problem existed and what happens when you don't do that. So you can show the price of the penalty that you pay for that. And I think Wells Fargo is one of the best case examples of that, of just a complete failure to consider that. But it's a really hard bias to overcome.
And I see my timer, I've got 1 minute, so I'm going to sneak in one last one if that's okay with you. And that is, do you see a difference in the crisis response between a B2B and a B2C business?
Yes. B2C is much more responsive. Particularly, I call them paracrises. It's when you have to manage a crisis in public. So it's not really a crisis, but it's a risk. They're very attuned to those because they're afraid they're going to spread and more customers will talk about them. B2Bs are a bit more reserved because they know who their stakeholders are, and a lot of their crisis communication can go directly to those stakeholders because they have so few in terms of what they have. So I think there's a greater responsiveness among those that are consumer facing than the B2Bs.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I loved hearing that. We've read it and studied it so many times, and so to hear it from you has just been fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us from Texas. And I'll invite you and everybody else, in the spirit of conference, we'll be here 4 o'clock Mountain, 6 o'clock Eastern for Crisis and Cocktails. So if you just want to pour a glass of wine or a rum or a sparkling water and just pop in, and hopefully we'll have some of our presenters and attendees just come and have a chat and interact. So that might be another chance for folks to ask some questions.
Yeah,
so thank you very much for being here. It's been wonderful, and I look forward to catching up with you again very soon.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you again.
So just 5